This is Main Street on Prairie Public. I'm Doug Hamilton, and we call the show Main Street because these microphones are our virtual Main Street across North Dakota this time of day, where we, talk to our friends and neighbors just like we would if we were crossing a main street and saying hello. We're friendly. And in many of our main streets, those that are in county seats, for example, you can probably see the courthouse from the main street. And that will give you a clue about what we're going to talk about today. Ashley Thornburg is with me in studio, and on the phone is Eric Olson. He's an attorney and author. He lives in Missoula, Montana. He's written a series of books about Montana courthouse tales. His most recent is Courting Law, and we're going to talk about literature and law.
Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you.
You traveled across the state of Montana, visiting more than 50 courthouses, diving into the history, both the buildings and the cases that famously or infamously took place. This is a real, boy, if these walls could talk kind of series, wouldn't you say?
That's exactly right. And it all sprung out of my 35 years of experience as a criminal trial lawyer, listening to what happened in the courtrooms as I was standing there and wondering what else might have happened in many of the places that I hadn't been.
In your website, you described the time you were led into a county courthouse records room and stumbled across a major case when you looked in the first box of records. So was that the genesis for this, or were you thinking of writing this series of books before you stumbled across that story?
Well, briefly, actually, I had some thoughts ahead of time. When I was nearing the end of my practice, I had become fairly disillusioned and cynical about what this justice system was all about and how I could stand in court and tell a story and have somebody hear it and hear something completely different. And I guess that's not too unusual from what we're seeing in the world these days. And so I thought, maybe it was time to use a different skill set to try to help people understand and communicate with each other. So I decided to turn from advocating to writing. And I just happened to be crossing the state. I stopped in a small town called White Sulphur Springs, and I walked into the courthouse there, wondering, boy, here I am out in the middle of Montana, not too many people here, and yet here's a courthouse that was built with public funds. I wonder what this courthouse is here for. I sat in the abandoned courtroom that day, abandoned because there was nothing going on, and started wondering, what if walls could talk? What would they tell me? I went to the clerk's office and asked, about the history of the county, and she quite honestly said, well, not much has gone on that I'm aware of, but the files are all downstairs. We could go down and look. And so we went down into the basement, and there were stacks and stacks of old banker's boxes with all sorts of county records, not just case records. I knew two things about that county. One was that it was named for Thomas Marr, famous ex-governor and remarkable individual years ago. And secondly, that 100 years before, they had hanged 3 people on the courthouse lawn for robbing and murdering a guy on the train. She said, hey, you're welcome to take a look in here and see if you can find anything of interest. And this is a true story. I pulled the box down from the shelf that was not marked, pulled the lid off it, reached inside, and what I pulled out was the file of one of those 3 defendants who had been hanged. And I opened it up and pulled out a document, and it was the actual death warrant. And that kind of gave me a chill and reminded me that history is everywhere. So,
how many of these court cases made you think maybe the portrayals of the Wild Wild West aren't so, Hollywooded up around here? There's an old tale or an old saying about if you gave an infinite number of monkeys an infinite number of typewriters, eventually they would type every book that was ever created. And I guess you have a lot to work with when you're dealing with infinity. But that thought came to mind as I traveled around and heard these stories, and that is that these are stories of all of us, and eventually everything tucks back in on itself so that you hear some aspect of the same theme. And so I guess I kind of came to the conclusion that everything that happens is not so different from everything else that's ever happened. In the end, we're all people attempting to find answers for what we've done.
Well, it would seem to me that those records that you have from courtroom cases would provide a wealth of details that a writer would really welcome.
They really do, and the stories, in a sense, they write themselves, because as a lawyer, you're trained to learn the structure of a case, and the cases have what's called the pre-beginning, I guess, of the legal starting point, which are all the things that happened before the case walked into the courtroom, and then you have all the benchmarks of the legal process that take place during the course of the case, and then you have the judgment, the verdict and the judgment, and the aftermath, and that's a story right there. So it lends itself to being set up in whatever format a storyteller wants to put it in.
As you were reading through some of these, particularly the older files, you know, our understanding of human behavior is constantly evolving. I mean, think about the Salem witch trials and the understanding now that that almost undoubtedly was a case of poisoning from the rye crop that year, and yet it led to, well, I struggle to use the word judicial system, but what was a judicial system of the day, and hanging these people and throwing them in rivers. What kinds of cases stick out in your mind that you know would just be tried vastly differently today?
Well, I'm not sure I can put my finger on something that's quite that obvious, but I will say that throughout all my books, all 4 books, the thread of sedition cases winds. And of course, we're now sitting on the centennial of World War I, and the cases that wound up in court, Montana was sort of in the vanguard, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, for the development of a law that became implemented nationally, attempting to enforce or to curtail free speech. And there are some pretty chilling stories that I came across that covered, you know, I guess most of the country, but certainly the upper Great Plains and the northern plains, the Dakotas, the people that farmed and ranched on the hardscrabble country of the Dakotas and Montana.
There were a lot of Germans up here. Yeah.
That's right. There were a lot of Germans, a lot of Scandinavians, a lot of Eastern Europeans, and many of them, of course, spoke with heavy accents and had opinions that were closely related back to what was going on in the homeland. And of course, that was a war that America was eager to go fight, but ultimately couldn't figure out exactly what it all meant by the time it was over. And 100 years from then, we're still trying to figure out what World War I meant. So the sedition cases, I would hope, would be the concept of sedition, I would hope, would be treated differently today in the age of hopefully free speech.
How did you select the cases to highlight in your book? Was it the personalities? Was it the legal strategies? Was it the issues that were being talked about?
I would say, surprisingly, or not helpfully maybe, I would say yes to all of the above. I was looking to try to find stories that were character-driven, or driven by endings that were that sort of conformed to the old adage that the truth is as strange, at least equally strange as fiction. You know, there's a quote by Rudyard Kipling: "If history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten." And one of the things that a friend said to me years ago when I started this project was, you know, good luck. I mean, the last thing we need is another book written by a lawyer. You know, and that struck home, because I realized, even though I had spent a lot of years talking to juries, you do have to shape things in the form of a beginning and a middle and an end, or a premise and then a contradiction and then a resolution. And so as I went through these stories, I wanted to make sure that I understood the history of the community, so that I got to the biggest cases, so that someone didn't say, well, gee, you missed out on the Nelson case or whatever. And yet I knew I couldn't include every case. And I found some very small cases that have little human factors to them that I think fit into the overarching narrative as I decided to set up each chapter.
The series is the Montana Courthouse Tales. This is a 4-part series, the most recent book, Courting Law. How are the books different from one another?
You know, they're different in the sense that each of them is the same as the other, and that makes them different. That what I mean by that is there was
was no particular sense of organization or selection when I decided to write the first book, and I did not go into this project committed to visit every courthouse and write about every courthouse. What I wanted to do was to write and to try and take my experiences and my education as a lawyer and produce some writing that would be both entertaining and educational, and to help vent some of the frustration that I mentioned earlier that I had over not understanding really what the justice system was all about. That led to a pattern of trying to include in each book different sections of the state, so that I have East, Central, South, and West in each book. And of course, the individual books are shaped by the personalities of the particular chapter. So actually, I'm not sure that answered your question, but that was the thinking behind it.
Have you had any feedback from readers who may have had a connection to a case you wrote about?
You know, I have. It's really fun. Yes, the answer is yes. And I mentioned in one of my books a story about Garfield County, which is Jordan. And in the early days of Garfield County, they were holding, this is back in the late teens and early 20s, the 20th century, they were holding trials at any place where they could find a large enough facility to accommodate what they wanted, and they were mindful of not wanting to have people travel too far over that very large rural county. And so they would hold cases sometimes at private residences or even at a barber shop or something like that, lacking a courthouse. And there's a story that I came across that I actually met I think it was either a grandson or a great-grandson, who told the story of his grandfather, who wound up sitting on a jury that met at a cabin on an assault case. And the judge took the jury and the bailiff and the witnesses out of town about 40 miles to this cabin. And in the end, when the trial was over, when the evidentiary phase was over with, the judge told the bailiff to take the jury to the jury room to deliberate, and they all looked at each other. There was no jury room because there was no courthouse, and so they walked across the path to the chicken coop, and they all went in the chicken coop and deliberated there. And this was a story that was passed on to me by someone who was descended from one of the original jurors. Another example in Circle, which is in Macomb County, near Jordan, out there in eastern Montana, the curator of the museum was actually I believe it was his brother had sat on one of the big homicide case juries in the 1950s and had been in the courtroom when the gun discharged into the ceiling of the courtroom. So,
well, I happened to be out in Jordan 20-plus years ago for the Freeman standoff, and I read an excerpt in one of your books. It was Courting Justice, I believe, about a chat you had on the Amtrak crossing Montana with a couple of people about that incident. And it was an interesting story to cover at the time, and it's always interesting to read about it 20-some years later. So thank you for writing about it.
Oh, you bet.
You've got an interesting anecdote about something that happened in Blaine County where you're working with a ghost or something?
I set up a narrative where I was talking to a ghost.
There it is.
The ghost of a defendant named Frank McDaniel, who was one of the first defendants to be tried, one of the first 4 or 5 cases that was ever tried in Blaine County. They had a rash of murders right at the time of the creation of Blaine County, Chinook, which is up on the High Line. And he got arrested, and the facts of the case aren't important, but one of the issues that occurred was his lawyer discovered after the jury came back and announced the verdict, the jurors were polled, and he discovered that they had been drinking beer in the jury room during deliberations. And, of course, Frank apparently got quite upset, thinking that made a difference in the deliberations. And they got affidavits from jurors, which I have photocopies of and saw, and they took the case to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court apparently, they issued a ruling and said, well, apparently drinking in the jury room isn't really that bad of a sin, I guess, considering all the facts of the case and the fact that we have to let juries kind of do their thing. So I thought that was an interesting little twist. I don't know how the courts would treat it today, 100 years later.
Well, up on your website, there's a blurb that's kind of illustrative of where you're coming from. Montana's courthouses where the ghosts have the last word on the truth. You, of course, have been writing about judges and other attorneys. How candid are you about that? Are these all historical people, or do you have to be careful?
No, I don't think I'm concerned about being careful, other than just sort of the general rules of reasonableness whenever you write about anything. Much like you folks, when you tell a story on the radio, have to be careful about the limits that you recognize. But no, I've had great success, and some of the stories which are more recent in time, I actually went to the sources and talked with them and informed them about how the story was going to be written. I changed the names in a few cases. There is some sensitivity to some of the victims and some of the principal players. When I see legal misbehavior on the part of a lawyer, I don't generally tend to shade that. But, you know, where there was a victim who suffered sometime, or a defendant who perhaps is still back in the community and trying to distance himself or herself from his past, I might have changed the name. But every story that's discussed in all the books has an actual case file, and how I treated it. You got to remember, I was a trial lawyer, and trial lawyers make their living by standing in front of juries and telling stories. And naturally, if we all agreed on the facts, there wouldn't be any need for trials. So.
Eric, you've used the word disillusionment a couple times in this interview. What are some of the factors that really contributed to that?
You know, most of my legal career, I represented people who were in trouble with the system on some level or another. And what I learned as I moved, not only through my legal career but through my life, is that human behavior is filled with an infinite number of shades of gray. It's very, 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 very rarely that there's a black and there's a white. We've seen some instances where I think we can all agree that a person or an action was black or white, but most of the time there are factors, mitigating factors or aggravating factors that tend to make the behavior a little less clear. And so that part of that was my frustration with trying to hope that I could convince people, or at least let them hear me, about perhaps some factors that had been at work in my client's life that may have compelled the action that was clearly inadvisable and probably illegal, but maybe not necessarily quite as black-hearted as it was being portrayed. And in my own situation, I had the wonderful opportunity to represent people. For many years as a public defender, represent people who had family members who would come to me and say, you know, I never understood why we had the right to counsel. I never understood why lawyers represent people. It's so lonely. No one believes me, and I'm glad at least that I can have a conversation with someone whose job it is to listen to me and to try to formulate an explanation for what I believe happened. And so I think we all go through that in our lives. We get in situations where we wish we could explain a little more clearly, perhaps, what really happened. I guess it starts when we're kids and our parents come into the room and ask us or accuse us of something. So.
Eric Olson is an attorney and author. You can find out more about him at ericolsonmontana.com. Eric is spelled with a C, Olson with an O-N. And you have completed this series of books in the Montana Courthouse Tales, the most recent being Courting Law. We've been talking about that, but you're moving ahead in your, fiction area here. Tell us about Sardonyx.
Well, I have a storyline that I've been working on for several years. It's totally unrelated to legal issues. It's a story that goes back in time to a concept of a sort of a magical spell and eternal love and search for the meaning of life and love. And it really is a genealogy story about a young woman who learns about her grandfather and what he came across during his time in service in World War I. As a matter of fact, he uncovered what proved to be been working on as I've periodically as I've tried to get the courthouse tales completed.
Well, we'll leave it with that. Eric Olson, attorney and author. He's on the phone with us from Missoula, Montana, and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed chatting with you.
Coming up on Main Street, Natural, North Dakota.